If you owned an Xbox 360 early in its lifespan, and if you were also a fan of action shooters and online multiplayer games, then at some point you have inevitably run into Lost Planet. It was an odd blend of Western tropes mixed with Japanese game mechanics and aesthetics. It had an avid multiplayer scene, a pretty well-liked single player, and a story not a lot of people talk about. And it also spawned a few sequels. Nowadays, you mention Lost Planet, most people probably have no friggin' clue what you're talking about. So, what's the deal with this game? Why was Capcom so hell-bent on reaching a more global audience during this time? And how did Lost Planet get affected by that? Why was Lost Planet ultimately lost to time? Well, let's sit down by the fireplace, grab ourselves some hot chocolate, and wrap ourselves in a nice, cozy, warm Vital Suit. This holiday season, we're taking a deep dive into Lost Planet 1 to see what the big fuss is all about. Lost Planet Extreme Condition. Lost Planet was always one of those game series that I would kind of glance at from afar, but I never really bought or played, or knew anyone who played it for that matter. Actually, you know what? I remember I tried the demo way back in the day, and I remember kind of having fun with it. But other than that, I had no experience with this series for the longest time. Eventually, I finally played it, I enjoyed it, but I always kind of forgot about this game. Only rarely would I think back to it. Mainly around winter. Hey, it's a good Christmas game, but what about this game kept drawing me back? What is the secret behind Lost Planet? Well, strap yourselves in, everyone. We're going to revisit the frozen wastelands of Lost Planet Extreme Condition. Its gameplay, its story, and the sad course that the franchise took right after it. Games like Lost Planet 2 and 3. This series took a really sad departure. Yet there is still a loyal fan base, even to this day. It's small, but extremely dedicated. So seriously, what is there about this game? Does it hold up, or is it better left just forgotten? That's what I want to get to the bottom of. So before we start, I'm going to have to talk about the premise. Oh man, this story. Well, okay, I'm going to keep it simple for you guys now, but trust me, once I do a full deep dive, it is going to get very convoluted. Actually, the one thing about this game's story that I do like is the premise itself. It's pretty solid. It's just that the game kind of gets lost in the sauce, and, well, it's complicated. I'll get into that later. So, Lost Planet. The game is set sometime in the future on the frozen wasteland of EDN 3, an Earth-like planet going through a very intense ice age. Colonization of EDN 3 starts 150 years before the game. Since Earth was slowly becoming uninhabitable, an interstellar megacorporation, Neo-Venus Construction, which is just called NEVEC for short, starts sending human colonists to set up shop. Those colonists build huge bases and cities, but slowly and surely as they start to expand, they encounter the planet's native life forms, the Akrid. Technically multiple subspecies of bug-like creatures that are equipped to survive the harsh winters, thanks to the orange substance within their bodies, thermal energy. They wreak havoc on the early settlers, attacking outposts and colonies, and they do so much damage that a lot of the colonists just straight up flee the planet. Although, not all of them. Only the lucky ones were able to leave. Many were left behind. It's been 150 years since the first failed colonization attempt. Since then, the humans of EDN 3, those that remained, have survived as nomadic bands of snow pirates. They travel the frozen wasteland, fighting Akrid, harvesting thermal energy, and exploring the abandoned remains of these giant empty cities and bases from over a century ago. However, after all this time, NEVEC has finally returned to EDN 3 to begin a second colonization attempt. This time they're prepared, with large armored mechanized suits, called Vital Suits, mainly as a way to combat the Akrid. They are big, sturdy, and they use up a lot of thermal energy, but they can do a whole lot of damage as well. Soon, multiple factions arise on EDN 3, different factions of snow pirates and even NEVEC themselves, all using these Vital Suits to fight the Akrid and even each other. You play as a guy named Wayne, a Vital Suit pilot in a small band of snow pirates led by his father, Gale. The first mission starts off with you and your team attacking a massive Akrid living within a domed city, nicknamed Green Eye. However, the battle is short-lived as the snow pirates are killed, Gale's Vital Suit mysteriously explodes, and Wayne wanders out into the snow before collapsing and passing out into a coma, frozen inside his own suit. An unknown amount of time passes until Wayne is finally rescued by another small band of snow pirates. This gang is led by a man named Yuri, and he's helped by two siblings, Luca and Rick. It's mentioned that the device on Wayne's arm is a harmonizer given to him by his father Gale, and it's what's kept him alive all this time. Wayne can't remember much about the incident, but he is fit enough to go back onto missions. So after getting acclimated to the team, Wayne ventures out there to help the snow pirates in various missions, either fighting the Akrid, other snow pirate factions, or perhaps uncovering Nevik's true intentions with EDN3. I'll get into the story later. Trust me, there's way too much to talk about right now. But that's the premise so far, and all you really need to know for the time being. Trust me. Lost Planet is a third-person shooter, but that hardly covers how it plays. For starters, you'll notice that the crosshair can be unlocked from the center of the screen. I have no fucking idea why they did this. Some games have free look like this, but it's usually like flight simulators and stuff like that, like games where you're controlling a vehicle that needs it. I remember Gunmetal had a similar thing going on, but that's because you spent half the time flying around in that game. Here, it doesn't serve any purpose. Like, yeah, you can look around and shoot. I see this as an experiment. It doesn't hinder gameplay, nor does it really enhance it. The settings for this game are also very limited, but at the very least you can set it to a fixed crosshair. Although I will say, I did have moments in this game where if I have the crosshair fixed, sometimes my model can get in the way and block what I'm shooting at. So I imagine that maybe the loose crosshair was meant to fix this? I'm still not sure. Either way, it was something I enabled and disabled throughout the campaign just to get a feel for it. There's also a first-person mode to help you aim better, which to me is a clear sign of the devs just accepting defeat. Aside from that, the controls are pretty responsive. Shooting feels good. But how about the gameplay overall? Well, Lost Planet is an action game. Dare I say, a sandbox action game at that. The game gives you a small but decent arsenal of guns. There's a variety of enemy types, and levels are surprisingly hands-off at times. The guns that you can pick up are all very stock standard. Seriously, if you've played a video game before, you've encountered each and every one of these guns. Assault rifles, shotguns, snipers, rockets, plasma rifles. You can also pick up vital suit weapons. Now these are meant to be attached to a vital suit and fired from there, but you can still pick one up and use it if you want to. It's huge and heavy as all hell, and when you fire it, you can't even move. But it's sometimes a vital strategy if you're out of weapons. I think a lot of the guns are just kinda serviceable, if a little weak. The starting machine gun you have is okay on smaller Akrid, but it has really bad accuracy at longer range, and there are way too many enemies in this game that can just eat an entire magazine like it's nothing. The shotgun is fun, except this might be the single most inaccurate shotgun in any game I've ever played. The sniper was actually my go-to on levels that had it. I think because of how consistent it was with damage. It's accurate and a one-shot kill for headshots. Otherwise, things like rocket launchers and grenade launchers, you'll mostly be saving for larger boss fights. There's probably another thing you're noticing with the gameplay. The movement. This is a slow game. Your movement is pretty slow, animations are slow, and overall everything feels very weighty. Like if you land from a tall height, you stagger for a bit. If you do a dodge roll, you have to slowly roll back onto your feet. You get knocked back by an explosion, and you carefully pick yourself back up. Or better yet, when you switch weapons, you have to stand still for a split second. It's by far the biggest hurdle for the game. The staggering can get pretty brutal too. I've had many moments where I just get stuck in an infinite loop as the enemy would knock me on my ass, and then I'd slowly get up, only to get knocked back down again. It can get ridiculous in some levels. It feels kinda dated, especially to a lot of other third-person shooters. Like every single task you have is slow and it forces you to pause just briefly before you can move again. I think this is the ultimate filter to Lost Planet. If you can get through the weighty movement, then the gameplay won't be a problem. But if you approach this game desperately wanting it to be faster and have zippier controls and movement, then this is going to be a pretty big barrier to entry. Compared to a traditional third-person shooter, probably one that we think of today, Lost Planet does seem weird. However, it's not fair at all to compare it to games like Gears of War. Rather, I think a more fitting comparison would be something like Monster Hunter. Your character is super weighty, animations are slow and deliberate. Movement can be fast, but it requires a buildup of momentum, which can be easily lost. It's a slower kind of game, but that's not necessarily bad. The game is balanced entirely around it. As frustrating as some areas can get, just about every enemy is abiding by these rules. Most of the time. Like you aren't going to get brutally killed just because your dodge roll animation was just a little too slow. Except for the giant worm. Fuck this guy. So the movement is slow, a little clunky, but I don't think it's that hard to get used to. Although there's one more type of movement that you have in Lost Planet. A grapple hook. It's actually not used all that often. There's only a handful of areas that it even works on, so it's more of just a way for you to climb up platforms in a few selected levels that call for it. It's got a very short range, and since levels are very linear, you really can't use it to break outside the map. I mean, when it works, it's actually kind of fun, like being able to rappel down and shoot at enemies. But yeah, I don't know why it's there. I think the developers thought it would be cool, but never really had a chance to flesh it out. If the game were more explorable, I think it'd come in handy way more. Actually, you know what? Early in development, Lost Planet was meant to be more exploration focused, with larger, more explorable levels. However, that was eventually scrapped for more linear levels instead. Wait a minute. Grapple hooks, pilotable mechs? Shit, these guys were ripped off. The last thing I should point out is the HUD. Yeah, thermal energy. A fucking timer. This is another huge mechanic in the game, and even after beating it, I still don't know how to feel about it. Like, sure, it's unique, but I'm not sure if it really enhances the gameplay or not. In Lost Planet, the environment is so cold that it's actively trying to kill you at all times. I'm from Minnesota, so this is very relatable. So you need thermal energy just to survive. The Akrid drop it when killed, and the colonists use it to keep themselves warm or to power up their vital suits. So killing enemies will drop some for you to pick up. You can also get lots of thermal energy from data posts, which are scattered around most levels. Sometimes they're inactive, other times the enemy has activated them already. Either way, you just have to smash the interact button over and over until it changes orange. Then it gives you a boost of thermal energy. This stuff depletes slowly over time, but that rate can increase if you're in a vital suit, and especially if you activate a boost or something. So things like boosting forward or jetting up into the air, you've got to use that sparingly. It also majorly depletes when you take damage. This is kind of the point of thermal energy. It's not actually a death sentence when you run out. Rather, so long as you have thermal energy left, you can regain your health. Very fast too. But don't get me wrong, you are going to need thermal energy. All the enemies are balanced around the system, so when your energy is depleted, you can get one-shotted pretty easily. Once again, this just feels like the devs experimenting around. I think this was meant to encourage player exploration. Like if you hide data posts and enemies around the level, a player will be incentivized to go out and find them just to stock up on thermal energy. Except what it really does is create this artificial timer for a lot of levels that mostly just incentivizes you to skip past enemies and rush to the end, which is literally a viable strategy, by the way. As far as I remember, aside from boss fights, you can skip literally every other enemy in this game, and you can book it from the start of the level right to the end. It's a sandbox game, remember? No scripting here. But yeah, that wraps up the basics of on-foot gameplay. I'll talk about the rest of the features later. There's a lot to cover. I guess now's a good time as any to bring up the graphics and presentation while we're at it. Lost Planet came out in 2006 and it definitely shows. There's a lot of quirks with this game's graphics that are really a clear reminder of when it came out. Things like the color choices, model details, but most notably bloom. Yeah, this was the era. Back in the day, bloom, and more specifically HDR lighting, was this brand new shader feature that a lot of games adopted. DirectX 9 paved the way for it, but it wasn't really until the mid-2000s that developers became fucking obsessed with it. It's specifically this window of time where you see a lot of games adopting a very desaturated, bloom-heavy art style. Now, some developers managed to use it sparingly. I know this is a very unfair comparison, but I think Crysis, which came out a year later, is a pretty famous example of using bloom and HDR perfectly. Hell, I think Halo 3 is a great example of using just the right amount of bloom. But on the flip side, there were so many more games that misused bloom and HDR. Way too many games to list. It was a fucking unstoppable trend, to the point where I see this aesthetic and I immediately get flashbacks to the early 7th gen. This defined this period of gaming for me, and Lost Planet unfortunately was not spared. If you hate mid-2000s games with a lot of HDR and bloom, then sadly Lost Planet may not be the game for you. Remember, this game is entirely set in the snow. God, playing this in the dark feels like getting hit with a flashbang sometimes. There are a handful of levels that do minimize this, usually with darker, moody lighting, but God, every now and then you just glance at the horizon or the sky, and all you can see is solid white. Hey, I guess for all of this game's faults, the sequel leaned even more into this aesthetic, and it looks like a Gears of War clone because of it. I guess another defense of this game's art style is that even though its color palette is pretty desaturated, it's not overly so. The game's environments consist of crumbling concrete buildings and worn-down military bases. These are meant to be dead, empty cities on a cold and frozen world. So yeah, with lots of snow and with lots of desaturated blues and grays, this place is meant to feel cold and barren. But it doesn't use cheap ways to limit the color palette. Like some games, to do this, they'll just cover the entire screen with a fucking brown and gray filter over literally everything. Here though, through the blue, white, and gray, you can see bits of color, like the green of a street sign, or the orange of magma, or maybe the bright lights of high-tech equipment. The environment itself is desaturated, but not everything with it. So I'm glad that the game doesn't artificially desaturate the image. But you know what, and yeah, this just might be showing my bias towards early 360 games, but overall, I kind of enjoy how this game looks. Aside from the blue, that's still annoying. Otherwise, aside from that, this game still looks pretty damn good. Some sections are a little simplistic and boxy, but god, there were quite a few parts of this game where I just kind of had to stop and take in the environments. Because, yeah, some sections look downright beautiful. While the lighting is nothing to write home about, it definitely can create a really good atmosphere at times. For a 2006 console game, the graphics hold up tremendously well. I actually think the best part about the graphics is the snow and particle effects. This is a snowy game. You are up to your knees in fresh snow. It's always snowing in each level. This entire planet is a winter wonderland. Hey, there's a reason I saved this game for December. And wow, for a 16-year-old game, this snow is still pretty damn good. And you really feel like you're in the middle of an extreme blizzard. This is the kind of blizzard that would absolutely clog the freeway for at least a few hours. Nobody's getting to work in this weather. Hell, there were a lot of games after this that weren't able to match its snow graphics. I remember Dead Space 3 kind of reminded me of Lost Planet when it came out, but comparing the two games, I think I have to give it to Lost Planet. Shit, the sequel Lost Planet 3 even had worse snow effects than this game. Although, Lost Planet 3 is another discussion entirely. So yeah, the snow is really well done. The only thing that really dates the game are the open environments. Like, they aren't bad by any standards, but for the time, they're pretty barren and empty. Like one level you'll get a pretty vast looking field of snow and it'll look pretty cool, but then the next level you'll get like a really ugly looking cave. Yeah, all of a sudden it looks super undetailed. So I think that's why I was never fond of these few levels. Because in contrast, we have levels set in dense concrete cities or vast open snowy landscapes. Honestly, I'd rather the whole game be set here. So yeah, most of the time you get to look at some of the best winter environments in any game ever, but then sometimes you have to look at Shadow the Hedgehog. There's one quirk I found with the graphics, and that's the camera shake effect. Whenever like an explosion goes off or you land from a really big jump in your vital suit, the camera shakes fucking violently. But it's not like a normal blur effect, it's this weird double layered effect. It's hard to describe it, so I'm gonna see if I can show it off better in editing. It's just a really bad effect, and it's just kind of annoying. No amount of graphics configuration can fix this. This is hard-coded into the engine. Anyway, that's just a nitpick. For a 2006 game, yeah, it holds up really well. Even the models. The character models look surprisingly good for the game's age. Fun fact, Wayne here is actually modeled off the South Korean actor Lee Byung-hun. Okay, this guy looks kind of weird. I think it's mainly his hairstyle. Like, seriously, what would you even call this look? Ponytails in front of his face? Luca kind of looks like Ashley from Resident Evil 4. I think it's the ears. Okay guys, this has been bugging the shit out of me. Who does Rick look like? His design is constantly making me do a double take because I swear I've seen this character before. At first I was gonna say he reminded me of JC from Sin, and that just might be because characterization wise he's the exact same person, nerdy kid who's a tech whiz and has 90s fashion sense, but his getup with his goggles and his dreadlocks, he also kind of looks like Blade too. Maybe I just have Sin on the brain, I don't know, but seriously, he reminds me of somebody. I just don't remember who. Outside of character models, enemies are also very nicely detailed. Oh man, the vital suits, however, look incredible. Sure, some textures on them are a bit muddy, but there is so much detail going on here that I can't not talk about them. So the mechs. Well, in game they're called vital suits. In Lost Planet, vital suits are basically the second half of the gameplay. They all vary in their appearance, design, and aesthetic. Some of these vital suits are a bit more rounded and industrial looking, others look very angular and high tech, and some are a bit more boxy and militaristic. There's an odd blending of different mech designs that on paper shouldn't really mesh that well. But overall, I think the variety works to Lost Planet's favor. The idea behind the vital suits is that they were built to survive the harsh winters and dangerous Akrid of EDN 3. Although a lore tidbit is that some of the suits were actually built for colonizing first and foremost, and then retrofitted with weapons after the fact. So they aren't all necessarily built for war. Rather, they're just kind of miscellaneous pieces of equipment, likely with more mundane roles. Like, you look at a bunch of these suits and it's pretty clear to see what some of their intended purposes were. Like the Evax, for example, has a super fast bike mode. This was probably built as just a way for people to quickly move between colonies to avoid getting stuck out in the harsh cold. Just a personal transport vehicle. Or this one. Sure, its 4 legs give it a pretty intimidating appearance. However, it is very slow and clunky, and it has built-in treads and drills. In fact, it's pretty weak fighting other mechs and even bigger Akrid. Yet it feels perfectly at home tunneling through bedrock. So in universe, this was probably designed as a mining vehicle and then weaponized after the fact. A lot of the other Vital Suits have details like this. They have things like thrusters built into them, but it's not really practical for attacking. Instead, something like the super high jump that a lot of the mechs come equipped with seem more like ways to navigate tall mountains and rough terrain. In fact, boosting uses up a lot of thermal energy, enough to where you should not be using it constantly over and over. You need to manage this. So when these things are on the ground, they're slow and cumbersome, just like the on-foot gameplay. Remember, this is not Armored Core. So it feels like a lot of these Vital Suits are just merely industrial equipment, made for different roles by different factions to fight the weather, the Akrid, and only very rarely each other. It's a great variety and by far the standout of Lost Planet. For most Vital Suits, you can equip 2 weapons, one for each side, and these are just scattered around the level, same as always. I'd say just about every mech weapon you can find on the ground is pretty decent, save for maybe the lock-on laser. But rockets, grenade launchers, giant mech-sized shotguns, and even the base minigun are all good enough to get the job done most of the time. And you can mix and match. Typically, you want a power weapon mixed with a minigun. A minigun can deal with smaller enemy threats, plus you can pick up a lot of ammo for it, as opposed to something like a rocket launcher, which you should only be really using on boss fights. However, you don't necessarily have to do that. If you want, you can equip 2 rocket launchers, or 2 shotguns, or 2 miniguns. The 2 minigun strat is surprisingly effective on Akrid missions. It's the most common Vital Suit weapon that you'll find in any level, so you'll never run out of ammo. Plus, it's literally just 2 miniguns. You do twice as much damage blowing apart Akrid. These weapons combined with just the sheer variety on hand really make this part of the game, controlling Vital Suits, feel super fleshed out. There is also a Vital Suit hierarchy, and you typically want to go for the strongest mech that you can find. However, sometimes your own Vital Suit gets destroyed, so you gotta swap to what's ever available. Hey, it's kinda like Halo. You've gotta stick with whatever vehicle you can find on the map. As clunky as the gameplay is at times, playing in a fully kitted out mech suit feels awesome. It's absolutely what the devs focused most of their attention on. At least when fighting Akrid. When you're fighting other Vital Suits and other humans, they kind of have their quirks, which I'll get into. And yeah, we're just full on talking about Vital Suit gameplay, huh? Alright, let's dive further into this. First, once again tying in with graphics, the explosion effects are way too damn big. Like, the explosion is blinding, it kicks up smoke everywhere. I mean, it looks pretty good, but it's almost too good, because it never takes one single rocket to kill an enemy. It often takes multiple. Yet it takes a decent chunk of time for the smoke to clear from a mech after you've shot a rocket or grenade at it. Which means that half the time when fighting another Vital Suit with a rocket launcher, you'll fire at them, maybe hit them, but you can't be sure because they're encased in thick smoke. Then you have to wait another 3 or 4 seconds for that smoke to dissipate. Which doesn't sound like a lot of time, but goddamn, when you're in the middle of an intense firefight and you pop off a rocket at a guy, the last thing you want to be doing is to see if he's going to rise back up out of that smoke. Every mech fight in this game, you're just constantly second guessing yourself. I mean, it's a nitpick, but it is very noticeable. Another quirk is that the 2 weapons that you can equip aren't pointed at the same target. Rather, they're both like slightly off center. They actually point at 2 separate reticles on your screen. Yeah, look at the crosshair. The left gun will aim exactly here, and the right gun will aim exactly here. Now, the reason I think they did this is probably for balancing, mainly with dual miniguns. The minigun, as I mentioned, is the most common Vital Suit weapon, so inevitably players are going to equip both of them, which itself leads into some balancing problems. In games that do have dual wieldable weapons, mainly Halo, both guns aim at the same target, but they're balanced pretty heavily. For example, in Halo, the guns that you can dual wield are all very inaccurate and only really effective at close range. Plus, they get a slight damage penalty, just so players literally aren't able to have double damage SMGs. But in Lost Planet, there is no damage reduction, and the minigun is shockingly accurate at most, if not all ranges. Having 2 miniguns can become way too overpowered if a player just wants to pot shot at enemies from across the map. So I'm guessing the split crosshair was meant to stop that. Like, it spreads your fire out and makes it so that you can't target a single small enemy with both of those machine guns. Probably for multiplayer balance as well. So yeah, the two reticles, I kind of get it from that perspective, but man, it kind of fucks with your head. Like, trying to decide which gun to use. Again, I just attribute it as a quirk with the gameplay. The only real complaint I have is that picking up weapons as a mech is kind of annoying. There is a single button for all interaction prompts, meaning that to equip a gun on either side of your vital suit, you have to actually adjust what direction you're facing towards it. Hey, bringing up Halo again, to dual wield in Halo, you actually have a separate input button to let you pick up a gun in your offhand, or if you want to swap it to your main hand, you have a separate input for that. Lost Planet could have used that. Instead, you'll be awkwardly sidestepping back and forth just to try and get this one weapon on your left side, only to accidentally pick it up on your right side. Which, fun fact, if you're already holding that gun on that side, the gun gets destroyed and you simply absorb it as ammo, meaning that you can't dual wield that gun anymore. That is kinda fucking annoying. Also, there's no way to grab a gun off another vital suit while you're in one. Instead, if you see another vital suit with a gun that you want, what you have to do is you have to hop out of your vital suit, go up to that mech, remove the weapon that you want, which in turn will drop whatever gun you're carrying. Then you move that gun to your own mech, attach it, then you go back and pick up the gun that you just dropped, and then you reboard your vital suit. Jesus, just give me a button to swap or something. Keep it simple. Anyways, I feel kind of bad for harping on the vital suits for this long. These mechs are by far the best feature of Lost Planet, and it's not hard to see why. Fighting other vital suits, fighting massive Akrid, the controls are tight, the gunplay is solid. Overall, these parts of the game were the standout. But as fun as the guns and the vital suits are, you need a good enemy to fight, and I think Lost Planet nails that.
The only good bug is a dead bug.
You'll be facing a lot of other humans in this game, rival snow pirates, Nevek, but by far the most interesting enemy here are the Akrid. They are the native life forms of EDN3, and their bodies contain thermal energy, a bright orange goo that can be used as an energy source. So while most of their body is usually a desaturated, cold-looking dark blue and black, there's always a bright orange spot marking where they're most vulnerable. A nice big fat target for you to shoot at. The Akrid come in many forms that each require very different strategies. Some are cannon fodder that can be killed quickly, and they might even just ignore you if you keep your distance. But pretty soon you're going to run into some big boys, like the Cryatus or the Dongo. Who came up with these names? You can kill this guy by just shooting at his abdomen with power weapons, or you can shoot at his arms, which are a little weaker. He'll still be lethal, but now he's down an arm. I actually really like this guy. He's a genuinely fun enemy to fight. On foot, when you first encounter him, he is fucking scary. But once you get your hands on a vital suit, all of a sudden the tables are turned. And also, I need to point this out, this game came out almost 2 years before Dead Space. This guy, on the other hand, has a protective shell and seems immune to whatever you can throw at it. But dodge his rolling attack and, yep, there's his weak spot. Or better yet, as he's rolling, chuck an explosive or fire a rocket at him and watch him tumble on his back. Whenever I revisit Lost Planet, as fun as it is to get into mech battles, I always remembered the Akrid fights above all else, and it's not hard to see why. While the human AI can be very cheap at times, the Akrid AI is very methodically designed. The player is slow and can only do short-range dodges at a time. Well, these guys have slow, choreographed attacks that you can counter. Even the boss Akrid are all pretty fun here. That's another thing I have to point out. Fucking awesome boss fights in this game. All of them were balanced and they felt very fun. Honestly, it's these fights with the Akrid where a lot of Lost Planet's features and mechanics really come into their own. And yeah, that's why these fights are what I remember the most from this game. The combat really shines during these encounters, when all these mechanics are finally working together and are in sync with each other. So yeah, the Akrid, as far as I'm concerned, top tier enemy design. I also kind of like how they look. They're all very bug-like, but also a bit alien. At least most of them anyway. I referenced Monster Hunter earlier, and hilariously there's a bit of that in here, where like there'll be these super alien looking monsters, almost Lovecraftian looking designs, and then one of them's just a giant moth. But otherwise the Akrid are very striking. Like, sure, they're bugs, but sometimes it's hard to tell what they even are. Like the Trillid. They're the most common Akrid you'll see, and yeah, they're just kind of an annoying swarmer. But I like their design. It reminds me of like some prehistoric Cambrian animal. Also, damn it. Okay, I have to bring this up. This is a gripe that literally no one on planet Earth but me has. These guys are called Trillid. Try. Try is in the name. Yet there's another Akrid called Sepia, which have 3 legs, 3 parts of their jaw, and are radially symmetrical into thirds. For the life of me, I always thought that these were the Trillids and the other guys were the Sepia. Like, logically, my brain would always switch the names on me because they fit better. But no, instead, these guys are the Trillid and these guys are the Sepia. Why wouldn't you call these guys the Trillid? That makes more sense.
Your basic arachnid warrior isn't too smart, but you can blow off a limb, and it's still 86% combat effective. Here's a tip. Aim for the nerve stem and put it down for good.
I like these ice bugs. It's interesting how they're able to work together as a single hive, even though they're made up of vastly different subspecies. Actually, in-game, it's unknown if there's any smarter, intelligent brain bug controlling them. I mean, Starship Troopers was definitely an influence for Lost Planet, but who knows? Like, are they even working intelligently? Or is it just bug instinct to repel the invaders?
A leadership cast, a hive brain.
Brain bugs? Frankly, I find the idea of a bug that thinks offensive.
I kind of like that ambiguity, except in Lost Planet 3, where they ruin it. But we don't talk about Lost Planet 3. Now, this is the nitty-gritty, the plot. Well, Lost Planet's story has quite a few problems. Nothing really plot hole related or character focused, rather it's the story as a whole. The general consensus for this game when it came out was that the plot was way too confusing and it had way too many twists and turns. Although even back when I first played this game, I never thought that was a fair analysis. But finally replaying it, I think I see what people actually mean about this game's story. Which isn't that it has too many twists and is too confusing, it's that it just has too much. Too much everything, actually. Too much story, too many characters, too many plot lines. Lost Planet isn't a confusing story, it's an overwhelming story. So let me break it down. And yeah, I hate to say it, but I am going to have to summarize the hell out of this game. So if you don't want to get spoiled or you don't even want to hear this game's story, then skip to here. So to recap, Wayne was rescued by the snow pirates Yuri, Luca, and Rick, and he's now helping them with odd missions like fighting Akrid or fighting rival snow pirates. However, it soon becomes clear that Nevik, who Yuri is kind of helping on the side, is up to no good. Yuri claims that Nevik have a way to terraform the planet and potentially warm up EDN3.
The Frontier Project is a large-scale undertaking to terraform the planet.
Which sounds good and all, but this is Nevik we're talking about. These creepy, mysterious mercenaries who work for a company that literally abandoned many of the first colonists. Oh yeah, I'm sure they have the best interest of everybody in mind. Sure they do. Early on, Wayne encounters a character named Basil. At first she fights Wayne until she recognizes him and then leaves him behind. The second encounter though, she finally reveals herself to Wayne and demands that they give up Yuri to her, as she's seeking revenge on him and Nevik.
He led my family and many others close to me into a trap and killed every last one of them.
Nonsense!
I'm not here to debate this. Just hand him over.
Yuri has also up and disappeared at this point, so that's great.
Yuri's things, they're gone.
What?
But seeing Yuri's not there, she leaves once again. With Rick and Luca's help, Wayne tracks down where he was first found unconscious and where his father died, the Dome City. They also find Gale's old vital suit, which has been enhanced to make it extremely powerful. So Wayne uses it to face off against Green Eye. After a lengthy boss fight, however, Wayne ends up getting attacked and surrounded by Nevik, led by a guy named Bandero. Ponytails over here. As they fight and escape, Wayne regains some of his memories, remembering that it wasn't the Akrid who killed his father, but it was Bandero and Nevik. They flee, leaving behind Gale's vital suit. Returning to Luca, they both find that their base has been attacked and destroyed, and Rick is presumed to have been captured or even killed. The two of them take on a guerrilla war against Nevik, who is slowly retaking control of the planet. A year goes by.
1 year later.
Yeah, a whole year. As in, the game jumps forward a year into the future. With narration, we learn that Luca and Wayne are using hit-and-run tactics against Nevik. It's during one of these attacks where they learn about Rick, who is in fact still alive after all this time, thanks to him being rescued by Basil.
From Basil? Basil?
After capturing and talking to a Nevik trooper named Joe, they learn about Nevik's plan to heat up the planet and drive the Akrid away, which then leads them to a volcano base, where once again Wayne meets up with Basil. They make their way through the volcanic area, using Joe as a guide. Basil, however, reveals quite a lot to Wayne. She reveals that the harmonizer on his arm, a device that she has as well, is what's kept both of them alive and young all this time, because it has the ability to prevent aging. It's also what unlocks Gale's vital suit. On top of that, Basil drops the bombshell that Gale has been dead for fucking 30 years.
Gale's death. It's been 30 years. I first came to this world 10 years before that.
What? What are you talking about?
The power to delay the aging process.
Yeah, 30 years. Wayne was frozen in that vital suit for 30 fucking years and is just finding out about it now.
I was buried under a mountain of ice for 30 years before Yuri found me.
Bandero has also survived all this time since he has yet another harmonizer, although his is simply a prototype for the one made for Wayne, hence why Bandero is so interested in him. But yeah, 30 years. This is a pretty big fucking bombshell the game throws at you, and it comes out of nowhere. You know what, Wayne takes this info pretty damn well, all things considered. He continues into Nevik's volcano base, and after another boss fight, he finds a man named Eisenberg. I don't know where Nevik gets its funding, but it's clear that they skimp out on barbers. It's revealed that he's overseeing Nevik's operations on EDN3 and was responsible for Gale's death, since Gale never went along with the Frontier Project, the project to heat up the planet.
What a sad end. I wanted Gale to come around and understand my dream. Then together we could have achieved it.
He also reveals that Yuri is still alive, but it turns out that Eisenberg is just a hologram. Although it takes Wayne way too long to figure that out. Now Joe is part of the team. Yeah, okay. And he has a lead on where Nevik is harvesting thermal energy. Wayne goes and kills a giant spider, only to yet again get ambushed by Ponytails over here, who shoots him in the leg and taunts him for a bit, until Joe arrives. Like any good villain, Bandero explains Eisenberg's evil plan. The Frontier Project isn't just going to heat the surface of EDN3, but it'll kill all the inhabitants as well, while Nevik watches safely from orbit. After which, Nevik will simply swoop in and colonize a defenseless planet.
Seeing as how nothing will be left alive on this rock once the Frontier system is set into motion, all this talk of heating the planet is only after all life has been exterminated. That can't be. Now.
I don't know if revealing that your plan will in fact kill everyone on EDN3 is that good of an idea, instead of just, just doing it and not telling anybody about it. But what do I know? I've never been in charge of terraforming a planet. Maybe Nevik is just super giddy and excited that they want to reveal their plan to everybody. I can buy that. Anyway, Bandero hilariously shoots Joe's gun out of his hand, but Rick shows up to save the day, letting the two escape. The Snow Pirates now know that they have to stop Nevik at all costs. Joe tells them he knows a secret underground passageway that could lead to the space elevator, where Wayne could stop Eisenberg for good. So they head through the tunnels, fighting a shitload of Akrid along the way before Joe and Wayne depart. Wayne eventually stumbles onto Bandero, who is now fully obsessed with Wayne, given how Wayne has access to all of Gale's tech, like his advanced harmonizer and his vital suit. So a pretty annoying boss battle ensues in this chaotic boss arena with these moving pillars, until he finally destroys Bandero's mech. He stumbles out, points his gun at Wayne, and then just falls over dead. Fantastic. Also off screen they find a tortured Yuri, who luckily has enough energy in him to upgrade Wayne's harmonizer, which in turn allows Wayne to unlock the full potential of Gale's mech. This is the reason why Yuri was working with Nevik in the first place, to secretly help Wayne behind his back. Basil helps Wayne gear up, but warns him that using the harmonizer might cause him significant memory loss, like it did with his dad's death. She sacrifices herself to let Wayne get to the orbital elevator, where in a pretty awesome section lets you fly around and destroy other vital suits like they're nothing. He finds Eisenberg in his own mech, and after a pretty annoying boss fight, where I think you just need to spam the buttons to beat it, Wayne finally defeats Eisenberg and saves EDN3, but not before passing out. Another year passes by. Oh jeez, okay. And Rick and Luca are on their own, slowly and safely melting the ice. Somehow, Wayne shows up, although he has no idea who Luca is.
I'm sorry. How rude of me. My name is Luca. It's nice to meet you.
The end. Oh, jeez. Well, the story's messy. Really messy. People were really confused by this game's story, and fuck, I still was until I did a clean playthrough for this video. And for good reason. There's just too much of it. Now, there's nothing wrong with trying to create a complex story. However, on the flip side, there is also nothing wrong with keeping a story simple, which is exactly what should have been done for Lost Planet. Because as I mentioned earlier, what drags the story isn't the fact that it has too many twists or a hard to follow plot, it's that there's just too fucking much of it. There are like 4 or 5 different plot threads going on that are all given an equal amount of attention. The first plot line is the overarching one, the fact that Snow Pirates are trying to survive on EDN3 against Akrid and rival factions. The second is Nevik's goal of burning the planet and everyone on it, in hopes of colonizing it for themselves, creating a war between Nevik and the Snow Pirates. The third is the story of Wayne, his father Gale, and him getting revenge for his father's death, which puts him against Bandero and Nevik. Fourth is Wayne helping Luca and Rick, and even Yuri at points, in uncovering the Nevik plot to terraform EDN3. The fifth and possibly final one is Wayne learning from Basil about the Harmonizer device, how the device plays into him being alive for all these years, why the villain wants it, and its connection to Gale's super advanced vital suit. Jesus Christ, and this is all going on in a game whose pacing feels like a TV show. Like seriously, there are missions where you're fighting all of these enemies, shit is intense, it feels like it's the end of the world. Oh god, look at this. And then you walk into a cutscene where people are just sitting around drinking coffee talking about the plot. I'm expecting Kramer to walk in at any moment.
What's going on in there?
I need to stress, all of these on their own aren't bad in any way. But when you are combining that with all these other plot threads going on, it just feels out of place. And these plot threads, why the fuck are there so many? It just overloads the player, and now, unless you're paying super close attention, you are not going to keep track of anything going on in the story. Even now, there's some weird dead-end threads that went nowhere. Like Basil said that Yuri killed her husband. What happened to that? That is literally never addressed again. Yuri's all of a sudden a good guy at the end. And I could nitpick the hell out of the story if I wanted to. Like how Wayne is thawed from his mech after 30 years and doesn't even ask what day it is. Do they not have calendars on EDN3? Hell, it's almost New Year's right now. How many people watching this video right now understand what it feels like to wake up after fucking New Year's Eve and having to ask what day it is? That's probably the first thing I would ask if I were Wayne. But then there's other things, like how the game will just skimp over character development. Wayne is thawed out of the ice, and minutes later, he's joining a bunch of strangers who he's never met before. I wish we could have seen some of that. Or like how Joe is kept as prisoner, only for the next mission, he's now best buds with Wayne. What? Where's that coming from? This is before he learns about Nevik's true intentions too. He's joining because I guess he just feels like it. I will say though, some of these cutscenes are pretty incredible to watch.
That VS belongs to me.
I'm not finished!
I can't quite find the words to explain why, but all the cutscenes in this game are just magical. Also, another thing, the awkward narration. Every now and then, like maybe 2 times in the game, you will hear Nolan North hop onto the mic to give you a recap of what's going on. Like he's now a narrator.
Meanwhile, Wayne and Luca have been separated from Rick and their base of operations.
He literally does this intro too. As this awesome fight scene is happening, it cuts to a static image where Nolan North is talking to you about the premise of Lost Planet and about what EDN3 is.
With the expansion of the colony, humanity encountered a new alien life form, known as the Akrid.
And it does this over and over. I can't express how jarring this feels.
The humans developed a weapon capable of fighting back against the Akrid scourge.
It's made even weirder by the fact that Nolan North is already in this game. He's Joe.
Hey, we can't just sit around here doing nothing.
So my only guess is that the developers realized way too late in production that the game has no introduction whatsoever, leaving players completely and utterly confused. So their idea was that they were going to splice in cheap intro narration into the first cutscene, and not even give the game like just an opening narration and then it cuts to the fight scene. It's spliced within that scene itself. So you have 2 things going on that feel completely out of place with one another. And I'm guessing that Nolan North was just the only person there to record that day. That is my only guess, because I have no idea what else it could be. I can't imagine that someone's first pitch for this game's story involved Nolan North awkwardly narrating the plot. He also shows up during the 1-year time skip as well to narrate to the audience what's going on.
1 year later.
But that leads me to another important point. What's with all the time skips? 2 weeks later, 1 year later, another year later, fucking 30 years later in the intro. Why? What's the point in doing this? Do we need a 1-year time skip halfway through the game? Is it really that important to the story? That 1-year time skip though, it comes straight out of nowhere. It gives you like a big cliffhanger and then it just says 1 year later. Like, what? What? It's like right at the halfway point. This should be like a rising action. Why is the game doing this now? This also is making me acknowledge the elephant in the room. Lost Planet should have been 2 games, or at least 2 parts. Like, it just should have been. Its plot is dying to be split across 2 separate games. Hell, maybe even 3 games. There's definitely enough story here for that. This game very clearly should be Lost Planet Part 1 and Part 2. Part 1 should be all about you fighting the Akrid, the snow pirates, and maybe trying to find out what happened to your dad. Then Part 2 should be all about Nevik. Everything they've done, their scheme to terraform the planet. The second half of this game should have been saved entirely for a sequel. Or if you just want to focus on one game, focus on one plotline. Maybe 2, but only if you can handle it. To me, I always remembered this game as just like a revenge story. Like Lost Planet, oh yeah, that's the game where you get revenge for your dead father. I totally forgot about everything else that happened in this game. Maybe my brain intentionally blocked it out, I don't know. But yeah, focus on 1 or 2 plot threads. Make a game all about surviving EDN 3 with Akrid and snow pirates, but also maybe it's about you getting revenge for your dad. Or maybe make it a story about Nevik trying to destroy the planet, and just focus on that. My point is, focus. Don't focus on a million other things at the same time. That's why Lost Planet's story is so weird and convoluted. I get the impression that the writers came up with a lot of different ideas and story beats, but they were maybe afraid of sticking to just one, so they desperately tried to shove in as much as they could. Hell, it was probably because of the fact that they weren't even sure they would make a sequel to this game, because as they were developing it, it was questionable if Lost Planet 1 would even be made at all. Capcom did not want Lost Planet at all. This game was actually briefly saved by KG and FNA, believe it or not. He was an executive producer for Lost Planet, but is probably more well known for being the artist and one of the creators of Rockman, or known in the West as Mega Man. Oh, also, remember Mighty Number 9? Yeah, that was him. Lost Planet was pitched right in the middle of an awkward phase for Capcom. The early 2000s were rough on them, with net losses each year being the standard. So as any company would, they bunkered down and they started focusing on building their franchises, not games. They were focused on making sequels and spin-offs. New IPs were a lot harder to pitch. In fact, most of them were outright rejected. Lost Planet was. The first pitch for Lost Planet was just straight up rejected by Capcom. In fact, another pitch that was rejected alongside it was Dead Rising. Lost Planet and Dead Rising were actually kinda sister games. An FNA, acting as executive producer on each project, presented both of them to Capcom. Both were rejected, but he really didn't take that to heart. He suspected that if both games were prototyped first, with the time and resources spent on either of those prototypes, Capcom would be less likely to reject their pitches a second time. So, under the radar, he let both games continue development until sufficient prototypes were made. With something to actually show, he pitched them again to Capcom, and his gamble paid off because both games were eventually greenlit. Also, don't go overpraising an FNA for Lost Planet just yet. There's a bit more Tim will find out in just a sec. Lost Planet itself took inspiration from many different sources. I joked about a couple of them earlier, but there were a bunch, from all sorts of genres and mediums too. Starship Troopers, John Carpenter's The Thing, mecha anime. Hell, even Halo was referenced as an inspiration for Lost Planet. And you can kinda tell with the sandbox approach to level design. Lost Planet was even meant to be an FPS at one point. As I said before, the game was going to be way more exploration focused, but they dropped that, either due to wanting to focus more on action set pieces, or maybe they were just limited by the 360's hardware. This game was a huge attempt by its developers to break into the Western market. Of course, it wasn't just trying to appeal to the West. In fact, a lot of its elements are very much made with Japanese audiences in mind. However, there was a clear attempt in this game to bridge what some at Capcom saw was a gap between the East and the West. And man, looking into this just opened an even bigger can of worms for me. There's an interview with an FNA where he talks about how, at least at the time, he saw the West as being ahead in game design, mainly in contrast to Japan. Literally saying, and I quote, "Western developers are leading the industry, with Japanese developers falling behind." Reading this in hindsight is pretty hilarious to see. Nowadays, I'm pretty sure most people, at least most normal people, would probably staunchly disagree with this statement. If anything, you could probably find more people who think the opposite. Japanese studios are putting out some of the best AAA games out there, while Western developers are kinda dragging it behind with outdated mechanics and downright predatory business practices. So in retrospect, this interview is not only bizarre, it's almost kinda despicable, but for people who weren't there to experience it, or maybe just don't even remember it, this was a shockingly common sentiment among Western game journalism at the time. The idea that Japan was lagging behind the West. You had so many people, so many public personalities just saying, well, Japanese games suck. The West is where it's at. Every game needs to follow Western tropes. So common that you could shit on other people's games entirely because they were Japanese.
Think about a recently Japanese game.
Is it what is about Japanese games that inspired us?
Recent.
Oh, recent.
They suck.
I'm sorry. Like, you guys need to get with the times and make better interfaces and like update your technology. We're totally kicking your ass. Back then, you guys were the king of the world, but your time has passed.
The thing that you should take away from this Phil Fish clip isn't necessarily the fact that he's making an ass out of himself. Rather, it should be the fact that nothing really happened to him because of this. If anything, quite a few people supported him.
This is, well, I mean, I don't like Japanese games either.
Games Media literally gave him a free pass on this. Yeah, Phil, Japanese games do suck. Yeah, this one poor Japanese developer who went out of his way to visit your Q&A deserves to be made fun of for being from Japan. Yeah, that's totally normal, Phil. Not something a psychopath would say at all, Phil. Could you imagine doing this but for any other country? Or better yet, could you imagine saying those exact same words right now? You would get crucified alive and you'd never be able to show your face at a games conference again. Yet Fish here still gets praised by progressive game journotypes. Why? It's hard to get to the bottom of why people just let this happen. I've seen a handful of developers, Japanese developers too, weigh in about their own ideas, and it may have just been an accepted idea among larger publishers and developers to keep this idea that Western games were on the up and up, and not Japanese games. Maybe since they saw Japan as competition, I don't know. Either way, this mindset permeated everywhere you looked back in the day. I don't think consumers and gamers actually cared. In fact, with all the brown and gray shooters of the 2010s, I can guarantee you, a lot of people were probably thinking the opposite. Nonetheless, developers, American and Japanese alike, had this idea drilled into their heads. Western game tropes good, Eastern game tropes bad. Okay, I'm starting to lose the plot here. I need to get back to my point. Lost Planet was made right in the middle of this. In this time where the West was constantly berating Japanese game mechanics. Japanese games were old and outdated, they were relics and not with the times. And it was Western game developers that had perfected the art of video games. Way too many developers, even from Japan, kind of shrugged their shoulders at this. And some of them just accepted it. They were like, well, this is what fat consumer Americans want, let's just give it to them. Lost Planet 2 and especially Lost Planet 3 were made right in the middle of this storm. Hell, Lost Planet 2 lost a ton of Lost Planet 1 fans. It focused on Western game mechanics, which was a big turnoff to people who loved the first game. This in turn also meant that newer people who were playing Lost Planet 2 were thinking that they were going to play a Gears of War style sci-fi game, only to then get disappointed when they found out that the game still retained a lot of its Lost Planet identity. A lot of critics were brutal on Lost Planet 2, entirely because they were expecting it to just be a Gears of War clone. And as such, 2 struggled to find a community as easily as 1 did. Yet despite this, if we go back to our pal Infinite, he tried to say that the reason Lost Planet 2 failed wasn't the fact that it was too Western, but that it wasn't Western enough, which paved the way for Lost Planet 3. So that's all I'm trying to say here. Lost Planet was a unique game. Its inspirations came from many different places, and it was made by a team of uniquely Capcom developers. That's its identity. And you can see this almost refusal to say Japanese with a lot of the games at the time. Not just with Lost Planet, but with Capcom itself. They went through a very rough period during this era. Really pushing to make their games as Western as possible. They were focusing on Western audiences. They were copying Western game mechanics, in some cases outsourcing their IP to Western developers. This is what happened to Lost Planet 3. Lost Planet 3 was quite possibly the most unnecessary sequel and aesthetic shift I've seen in a game ever. At least second only to 1 sequel. It took any semblance of character from 1 and completely got rid of it. I remember seeing this game at the time. Seriously, I do. I remember seeing the trailers for this game with its cowboy western soundtrack and Gears of War style combat and its all American developers and just thinking to myself, what's the point? I never beat 3. It was so fucking boring. All I know is I liked the atmosphere and that was it. It was just dull and had nothing to do with Lost Planet. The only thing I took away from this game was, okay, so you guys hate Lost Planet, but you very clearly want to make an Aliens game, huh? Seriously, everything about this game, they clearly wanted to make an Aliens third-person shooter. In fact, even though the soundtrack has a country flair to it, the main menu theme sounds like a ripoff of the Aliens theme from the movie. It's so similar, in fact, that I've actually used that particular theme in my Aliens Infestation video. I bet you guys didn't even know that the Aliens theme I used in that video wasn't even from Aliens, huh? Sorry, I had to just put that out there. Otherwise, I'd have no excuse to mention that. But yeah, Lost Planet 3. It felt so soulless. Like, they even got rid of the vital suits, which I understand, like, lore-wise, there were no vital suits in that era, because Lost Planet 3 is meant to be a prequel. But at that point, like, why even bother? Let's make a Halo game with no warthogs or vehicles for that matter. To me, that's the equivalent. The game just felt so soulless. Like, could they have at least kept up with Lost Planet 1's aesthetic at the very least? I don't know. So instead of keeping the game's identity and simply expanding upon it from there, Capcom decided to just hand it over to some literal Who developer, who in turn turned it into something Lost Planet never was. Generic. Capcom simply had no fucking idea what they wanted Lost Planet to be. To me, this is the prime example of why it's so important for a game to maintain an identity. Because that's the charm of Lost Planet, is that it wasn't a Western game. That it didn't try and be a Western third-person shooter ripping off Gears of War. Rather, it tried to use those elements and mechanics to make it something new. This is a distinctly Japanese game, made by distinctly Capcom developers, if that even makes sense. I think Lost Planet 1 has elements that are appealing to anybody who can appreciate a good solid action game. Not necessarily focused on a Western audience, but not necessarily pushing them away. I think that's where Capcom and Infinite got their wires crossed. People didn't enjoy Lost Planet in spite of its quirks. They enjoyed it because of them. And you know what? I kinda did too. So that's Lost Planet. I think I'll say it. I enjoyed this game. It wasn't perfect. In fact, it had a lot of problems. Yet, there's a really solid vision here. Lost Planet was always one of those games that never seemed to fit in with the popular crowd. It was always just appreciated by a select few. But I think that's what's charming about it. This is definitely a cult classic. It's got unique gameplay, quite a bit of content, and overall an aesthetic that is kind of unmatched. As far as mech-based Japanese third-person shooter winter games go, this is the best one. The story was kind of aimless, but I'd be lying if I said that there weren't some fucking awesome missions. This is a great starting game. Had a sequel properly built off of this, and not radically diverged from the core concept, this definitely would have been a well-remembered franchise. Alas, Capcom didn't know what to make of this game. Or a lot of the games for that matter. Ironically enough, I think Capcom, or at least some portion of it, figured it out in the end. Lost Planet 3 was one of the last games where Capcom outsourced their IP to an American developer. The company did a lot of soul-searching at that time. And since then, I think they've really gotten through it. Or at least mostly through it. Time will tell, of course, but their recent releases, especially following the 7th gen, yeah, I think I'll say it, I think they've made a comeback. I mean, look at what they've done for Resident Evil. So you know what? I would kind of like to see a reboot for this game. Keep it internal. Don't outsource it to a foreign developer. Don't try to mimic other games. Make it distinctly Lost Planet 1. Because I think it can work. Its weighty movement, its grapple hook, the on-foot and mech gameplay. There's a lot of stuff here that I wouldn't mind seeing improved upon in a potential reboot or sequel. And yeah, I know I joked that this game can be compared to Titanfall, but it's really not the same. Gameplay is slower and more methodical here. It very much reminds me of old Halo, in all the right ways. And you know what? Had I owned this game back in 2006, I could see myself getting addicted to it. I'd love to see this game make any kind of comeback. Although, seeing the direction Capcom is going, I doubt they're ever going to revisit Lost Planet. Franchises like Lost Planet, or even Dead Rising, I'm guessing leaves a very bad taste in the company's mouth. Lost Planet was one of the many games that almost destroyed them. There's a reason why we haven't seen anything Lost Planet related in many, many years. But damn, there is so much here that could easily be expanded upon. I think a full reboot wouldn't be a bad option. You definitely have to keep the winter aesthetic. Otherwise, keep the general gameplay, maybe expand the levels, give an emphasis on exploration. I'm not talking about open world, but something a bit bigger in scope. You could do a lot with thermal energy, maybe give an emphasis on trying to survive cold weather. I don't know, that's just me spitballing. Point is, I would love to see this game make a comeback. For as clunky as the story is, its gameplay and world kept me intrigued every step of the way. It's a fine action game that could be cleaned up in a lot of places, but it still has a ton of charm even 16 years later. As of right now, Lost Planet 1 is currently on sale for $3. For that price, I would absolutely recommend this game. I'd also recommend Colonies Edition, which is Lost Planet 1 but with way more features and inclusions. Except that game isn't available. Yeah, that game for whatever reason used Games for Windows Live, and after that broke many years back, Capcom simply removed that from store shelves, along with Lost Planet 2. They said that the games would return once they'd fix it, but they never did, so you can't buy them anymore. Yeah, Capcom really didn't like this game, huh? That's the video. I hope you guys enjoyed this tour down memory lane. I definitely did. Sorry this video took too long to get out. I guess I'm just slow when it comes to editing. I'll be getting another retrospective out soon alongside my normal videos and reviews. Thank you guys for making 2022 such an incredible year. I can't thank you guys enough for the amount of support that you've all given me. Take care, dudes. Happy holidays and have a wonderful new year.